Rick leaned on his pitchfork, wiping the sweat from his brow after a long day tending the farm. Just as he began fantasizing about dinner, a blinding streak of light ripped across the evening sky, landing with a ground-shaking thud in the middle of his cornfield. The smell of charred crops hit him first, followed by a plume of smoke that danced like an alien flare. Muttering curses about ruined harvests, Rick grabbed his flashlight and trudged toward the chaos. What he found wasn't what he expected, though. Expected didn't seem to cover much after this. Amid the broken stalks stood a small, sleek pod glowing faintly in hues of blue and green. The door hissed open with a sound eerily like a sigh, and out stumbled her. She wasn't human, though she wasn't not human either. Her skin shimmered faintly, her eyes gleamed like polished gemstones, and her outfit, or what was left of it, looked like someone had decided to design an armored bikini with a royal budget. She leaned against the pod, panting, clutching an orb that pulsed faintly in rhythm with her breaths. "Earthman," she gasped, her voice smooth but clearly strained. "I require shelter. I offer, you need compensation." Rick blinked. Pardon?" She gestured at him with a regal air, despite the fact she was clearly about 2 seconds from face-planting. "Shelter. Safety. I am hunted. My payment will satisfy all your needs." Rick didn't know whether to laugh, panic, or run, so he settled for his default, confusion. "Look, lady, I don't know who you are or why you're standing half-naked in my cornfield, but— Princess Zarathia of the Celestial Dominion," she interrupted, straightening as best she could. "And my attire is ceremonial battle regalia. It is not half-naked." "Sure looks half-naked to me." Her cheeks, or what Rick guessed were her cheeks, flushed a bright violet. "The ceremonial garments are optimized for combat and negotiation." Rick tilted his head. "Combat and negotiation, huh? Well, you sure negotiated the hell out of my corn." Zarathia groaned, her legs giving out beneath her. Before Rick could even think, she landed in his arms, light as a feather but radiating an odd warmth. He caught a whiff of something faintly metallic yet floral. It was weirdly pleasant. "Fine," he muttered. "You can stay. But you owe me for the corn." Her eyes flickered open, gratitude gleaming in them. "You will not regret this, Earthman. My payment will exceed your expectations." The orb in her hand suddenly began to glow brighter, casting their faces in soft, pulsing light. Rick frowned. "What's that thing, anyway?" "A relic of immense value," she murmured, cradling it protectively. "Priceless beyond measure in your primitive economy." Rick squinted at it. "Looks like one of those fancy lava lamps." Her violet flush deepened. "You dare compare the orb of eternal vitality to home decor? Hey, no offense, Princess Glitter, Zarathia. Just calling it like I see it." Zarathia muttered something in her language that sounded suspiciously like a curse. Rick didn't press. Instead, he helped her into the barn, settling her on a stack of hay that looked marginally comfortable. She sighed and leaned back, her glow dimming as she relaxed. "You are kind, Earthman," she said softly. "Don't mention it. Seriously. Don't. If my neighbors find out, they'll think I've gone crazy." Her lips curved into a faint smile. "Your world intrigues me already." The next morning, Rick regretted everything. Not because of Zarathia, well, not entirely, but because of the sudden realization that hiding an alien princess was way more complicated than agreeing to shelter a stray cat. For starters, Zarathia apparently didn't understand the concept of subtlety. He found her standing outside the barn, basking in the sunlight, her glow shimmering faintly against the morning dew. And of course, that's when Mrs. Henson decided to walk by with her yappy little dog. "Rick?" she called out, squinting. "Who's that?" Rick scrambled to block her view, but it was too late. Zarathia turned, smiling regally. "Greetings, fellow Earth female," Mrs. Henson gasped. "Rick Morris! Who is this woman? And why is she dressed like that?" Rick groaned inwardly. "She's, visiting." "Long story?" Mrs. Henson's eyes narrowed. "Visiting? In your barn? Does she need help?" Does she have papers? Is she? Fine, fine, she's my, He blurted out the first thing that came to mind. Girlfriend. Zarathia's glow brightened slightly. Girlfriend? What does this term signify? Rick grabbed her arm. We'll talk later, he muttered, dragging her back inside. Mrs. Henson stood there, stunned, before hurrying off, undoubtedly to spread gossip like wildfire. Inside, Zarathia raised an eyebrow, or something similar to an eyebrow. You used a falsehood. Rick sighed. Yeah, well, it was either that or try explaining intergalactic royalty to the town's nosiest woman. Zarathia tilted her head thoughtfully. I am unfamiliar with the dynamics of Earth, courtship. Is girlfriend a title of power? Something like that, Rick muttered, rubbing his temples. Look, just stay inside, all right? I'll figure out the rest. Zarathia's gaze softened. You have shown great kindness, Earthman. I shall honor your generosity. Yeah? Just don't blow anything up. Rick left, muttering to himself, but he couldn't shake the image of her faint smile, or the way her glow had brightened when he'd called her his girlfriend. He told himself it was just alien biology. Nothing more. Nothing more at all. The morning after the girlfriend fiasco, Rick thought the worst was behind him. That illusion shattered when he walked into the barn and found Zarathia holding one of his chickens upside down, staring at it with wide-eyed fascination. This creature, she declared, her voice dripping with royal authority, produces protein capsules, yes? I have heard of them. Remarkable. Rick froze, trying to process the sight of the princess, still glowing faintly, now covered in feathers as the chicken squawked its protest. Put the chicken down, Zarathia. We're not experimenting on it. She frowned but complied, placing the bird on the ground like it was a fragile artifact. Your methods are quaint. On my world, nutrient production is automated and far more efficient. Well, welcome to Earth, Rick grumbled, scooping up the startled chicken. We don't exactly have robot farms out here. Zarathia stepped closer, her glow warming. Perhaps I can improve your methods. My people are known for their innovations. She held up a strange metallic cube, the surface rippling like liquid. This device will revolutionize your operation. Before Rick could protest, she placed the cube in the center of the barn. It hummed softly, then emitted a series of bright pulses. Seconds later, Rick's entire stash of hay turned into what looked like neatly stacked green bricks. What the hell did you just do? He exclaimed. I converted your primitive storage material into compressed nutrient modules, she replied proudly. Compressed what? Rick poked one of the bricks, which was now solid and slightly warm. Zarathia, cows can't eat this. She blinked, genuinely puzzled. Why would you allow livestock to dictate the efficiency of your farm? Because that's how farming works. Their argument was interrupted by a knock on the barn door. Rick's stomach sank. He opened it to find Mrs. Henson standing there with her usual look of nosy concern, but this time, she'd brought back up the mayor's son, Ted. Ted, a self-proclaimed ladies' man, flashed a toothy grin. Heard you've got company, Rick. Figured I'd come introduce myself to the lady. Zarathia stepped forward, regal as ever, and Ted's jaw practically hit the floor. Well, hello there, he said, puffing out his chest. Name's Ted. And you are? Zarathia studied him like he was some kind of odd Earth artifact. I am Princess Zarathia of the Celestial Dominion, she said with practiced grace. Princess, huh? Ted said, clearly not comprehending the gravity of the title. Bet you don't meet guys like me back where you're from. Rick groaned inwardly as Zarathia tilted her head, genuinely curious. Your species exhibits confidence despite obvious physical and intellectual limitations. Fascinating. Ted blinked, unsure if he'd just been insulted. Thanks? Rick quickly stepped between them. All right, Ted, thanks for stopping by, but we're kind of busy here. Ted grinned. No problem. Just thought I'd invite you and your girlfriend to the town dance tomorrow. Everyone's talking about her, you know. Rick's heart sank. We'll think about it, he said quickly, pushing the door shut before Ted could say anything else. "What is a dance?" Zarathia asked once the door was closed. "It's a social thing. Music, awkward small talk, people pretending they're not drunk." "Ah," she said, nodding thoughtfully. "A ritual for selecting mates." "Not exactly," Rick muttered, though he wasn't entirely sure she was wrong. Later that evening, as Rick tried to fix the damage to his cornfield, Zarathia appeared beside him, holding what looked like a glowing fruit. "This is for you," she said, handing it over with a small, almost shy smile. "What is it?" he asked warily. "A delicacy from my world," she explained. "It enhances stamina and virility. A fitting gift for a mate." Rick nearly dropped it. "Mate? Hold on, Zarathia, we're not." "You called me your girlfriend," she interrupted, her expression perfectly innocent. "Is that not a term indicating courtship?" Rick groaned, rubbing his temples. "That was to get Mrs. Henson off my back. It doesn't mean, look, we don't just jump into mating here, all right?" Zarathia frowned, her glow dimming slightly. "Your species' customs are unnecessarily complicated." Rick sighed, softening. "It's not about being complicated. It's about taking time to get to know each other." She seemed to consider this, then nodded. "Very well. I shall observe your ways." The moment felt oddly tender, but Rick wasn't about to dwell on it. He turned back to his work, only to hear Zarathia mutter, "Your hesitation is illogical. I am genetically optimized for reproduction." "Not helping, Zarathia," he called over his shoulder. The next day, Rick's worst fears were realized when Mrs. Henson's gossip reached the diner. As he walked in to grab his usual coffee, all conversation stopped, and every pair of eyes turned toward him. "Rick," the waitress, Sally, said with a sly grin, "didn't know you had it in you." Rick froze. "What are you talking about?" Sally leaned on the counter, clearly enjoying herself. "You and that exotic girl staying on your farm. Heard she calls herself a princess." Rick sighed. "It's not what you think." "So she's not your girlfriend?" Ted asked loudly from across the room, his smirk as obnoxious as ever. Rick glared at him. "None of your business, Ted." Ted leaned back in his chair, looking smug. "Guess that means she's available, then." Rick felt a flicker of irritation he didn't want to examine too closely. "She's not interested," he said through gritted teeth. "Guess we'll see about that," Ted said, still smirking. Rick left the diner before he could say something he'd regret, but the tension stuck with him all day. When he got back to the farm, he found Zarathia studying his tractor with an expression of intense focus. "This machine is inefficient," she said as he approached. "I could improve it." Rick raised an eyebrow. "Let me guess. Alien tech?" "Precisely." He sighed. "Fine. Just don't blow anything up." An hour later, Rick regretted his decision as the tractor sputtered to life, now glowing faintly and emitting a strange humming noise. "It's now capable of plowing fields 10 times faster," Zarathia said proudly. Rick stared at it warily. "Yeah, but will it explode?" Zarathia hesitated. "Unlikely." Rick groaned. "Great. Just what I need, an alien tractor to add to my list of problems." She tilted her head, her glow warming slightly. "You are remarkably resilient for a primitive species, Rick." He couldn't help but chuckle. "Thanks, I think." As the sun set, Rick found himself sitting on the porch with Zarathia, the tension from the diner still gnawing at him. She glanced at him, her expression curious. "You seem troubled." "Just people in town talking," he admitted. "About us?" she asked, her tone almost hopeful. "Yeah. About us." She smiled faintly. "Perhaps your customs are not so different from mine after all." Rick laughed softly, shaking his head. "You're something else, Zarathia." Her glow brightened slightly, and for a moment, the barn and its chaos didn't seem so bad. Ted's smug grin flashed across Rick's mind all evening, leaving him more irritable than usual as he finished the last of his chores. He tried to brush it off, but the idea of Ted sniffing around Zarathia gnawed at him in a way he didn't want to admit. She was just a temporary guest, an alien princess on the run, no less. But the way she called him resilient, the way her glow brightened when she smiled at him, it was hard not to think about. As Rick leaned on the porch railing, staring out at the fields, Zarathia appeared beside him, her steps as quiet as a cat's. Her glow was faint tonight, almost like the moonlight. "You're pensive again," she said softly. Rick glanced at her. "Just tired. You humans often say you're tired when your minds are preoccupied," she replied, studying him with those piercing, gem-like eyes. Rick chuckled. "And you aliens don't bother with subtlety, huh? We value honesty," she said simply. "It is essential in relationships." Rick tensed. "Zarathia." She tilted her head, her glow warming slightly. "You've been different since your encounter with that other male." "Ted, was it?" Rick groaned. "Ted's a pain in the ass, that's all. Yet you seem to care deeply about his perception of me." Rick ran a hand through his hair, frustrated but unable to argue. "He's just not the kind of guy you want attention from." Zarathia's lips curved into a small, almost teasing smile. "Are you jealous, Rick?" Rick laughed, though it came out more nervous than he intended. "Jealous? Of Ted? No way." She stepped closer, her gaze never leaving his. "Your physiology suggests otherwise." Rick blinked. "My what now?" "Elevated heart rate, increased tension in your posture." She reached out, placing a hand lightly on his chest. "Yes. Definitive signs of territorial behavior." Rick's face heated. "Okay, you've been watching too much Discovery Channel or something." Her smile widened, and for the first time, he noticed the playful glint in her eyes. "Your deflection confirms my hypothesis." Before Rick could stammer out a retort, a loud crash from the barn broke the moment. Both of them turned just in time to see the doors fly open and two hulking figures step out, their outlines illuminated by the dim barn lights. "Princess Zarathia!" one of them boomed, his voice like grinding metal. "You are hereby ordered to surrender." Rick's stomach dropped. "Oh, great. More visitors." Zarathia stepped forward, her demeanor shifting instantly to regal authority. "You dare trespass on sovereign Earth territory? Leave now, and I may grant you leniency." The bounty hunters laughed, a harsh, grating sound. "Your diplomatic immunity means nothing here, Princess. You're coming with us." Rick, still processing the absurdity of the situation, grabbed the nearest thing he could find, a rusty pitchfork. "Hey! She's under my protection, so back off." The bounty hunters glanced at him, then burst into laughter again. "What's this? Her human consort?" Rick's face turned red. "I'm not her consort." Zarathia, however, took a step closer to him, her glow intensifying. "He is more than that. He is my chosen mate." Rick froze, his brain short-circuiting. What?" The bounty hunters stopped laughing. "Chosen mate? By law, that means—" "Yes," Zarathia interrupted, her voice firm. "By the laws of my people, any harm to him will be considered an act of war against the celestial dominion." The bounty hunters hesitated, clearly unsure how to proceed. Rick, meanwhile, tried to keep his mouth shut to avoid making things worse. One of the hunters growled. "We'll see about that." He reached for a weapon, but Zarathia was faster. She pressed a small device on her wrist, and a shimmering shield sprang to life around them. Rick stared at the glowing barrier in awe. "Okay, that's cool. Stay behind me," Zarathia said, her voice low but commanding. "Wasn't planning on jumping in front," Rick muttered, clutching the pitchfork tighter. The standoff didn't last long. Zarathia's shield held as the bounty hunters fired their weapons, but Rick could tell it wouldn't last forever. Thinking fast, he glanced at the glowing tractor she'd modified earlier. "Zarathia," he whispered, "can that thing do more than plow fields?" She followed his gaze and smirked. "It is equipped with basic defensive capabilities." "Why?" "Because I'm about to plow these guys out of my barn." Before she could stop him, Rick darted toward the tractor. He climbed into the seat, ignoring the strange hum it made as he activated it. The controls were completely alien, but he pressed buttons at random until something clicked. The tractor roared to life, its wheels glowing faintly as it lurched forward. Rick aimed it directly at the bounty hunters, who barely had time to react before the machine barreled into them, sending them flying into a pile of hay. Zarathia lowered the shield and approached, her glow brighter than ever. "Impressive, Rick. I underestimated your ingenuity." Rick climbed out of the tractor, grinning despite himself. "Yeah, well, maybe don't go telling people I'm your mate next time." Her expression softened. "Would you prefer I tell them the truth?" Rick hesitated. "And what's that?" "That you are a remarkable human," she said simply. Rick stared at her, caught off guard by the sincerity in her voice. For a moment, the chaos of the night faded into the background. Then one of the bounty hunters groaned, snapping them both back to reality. "We should secure them before reinforcements arrive," Zarathia said, her tone all business again. Rick nodded, though his thoughts were far from practical. As they worked together to tie up the intruders, he couldn't help but wonder if Zarathia was right. Maybe he was more territorial than he'd realized. And maybe, just maybe, he didn't mind the idea of being her chosen mate as much as he pretended to. The morning after the battle, Rick was nursing a sore shoulder and an even sorer ego. He wasn't sure what was worse, nearly getting killed by alien bounty hunters, or Zarathia insisting on calling him her chosen mate in front of them. That phrase alone had made sleeping nearly impossible. Every time he closed his eyes, he heard her voice saying it like it was the most natural thing in the world. But there wasn't much time to dwell on his existential crisis. Zarathia was already outside, her glow brighter than usual as she inspected the tractor with a critical eye. She had a way of turning every mundane moment into a royal decree. "This machine," she announced when Rick walked over, "performed admirably. However, it is still primitive. I will make further enhancements." Rick sighed, still groggy. "Can we leave the tractor alone for a day? I think it's been through enough." She turned to him, tilting her head in that way she always did when she didn't quite understand him. "The efficiency of your technology directly impacts your survival. Why delay progress?" "Because progress usually comes with a side of explosions when you're involved." Her lips curved into a faint smile. "I will take that as a compliment." Rick shook his head, deciding not to argue. "So, what's the plan for the bounty hunters?" "They're still tied up in the barn, and I'm guessing they're not the type to turn the other cheek." "They will be retrieved by my people," Zarathia replied confidently. "I have already sent a distress signal." Rick frowned. "Wait, won't that bring more aliens to Earth? Isn't the whole point of hiding here to keep things low-key?" "My people are allies," she said simply. "They will not interfere with your quaint civilization." Rick wasn't reassured, but before he could argue further, the sound of an approaching truck interrupted them. His stomach sank as he recognized the vehicle. It was Ted. And judging by the flowers sticking out of the dashboard, he wasn't here for casual conversation. Ted parked, climbed out, and sauntered over with all the swagger of a man who'd never been told no. "Morning, Rick." "Morning, Princess," he said, his grin practically dripping with smugness. Zarathia studied him, her expression as unreadable as ever. "Your persistence is remarkable," she said, though it didn't sound like a compliment. Ted chuckled, clearly missing the tone. "Well, I figured someone as special as you deserves a proper welcome to our little town. Thought maybe you'd join me for the dance tonight." Rick felt a sharp pang of annoyance. "She's busy," he said quickly, stepping between them. Ted raised an eyebrow. "Didn't realize you were her secretary, Rick." "I'm not," Rick snapped. "But I'm pretty sure she doesn't want to go with you." Zarathia's gaze flicked between them, her glow intensifying slightly. "This is a ritual for selecting mates, yes?" Ted grinned. "That's one way to put it." Rick groaned. "It's not, Zarathia, don't." "Very well," she said, cutting him off. "If this ritual is important to your culture, I will participate." Rick stared at her, stunned. "Wait, you're going with him?" She gave him a calm, almost amused look. It is not your decision to make, Earthman. Ted looked like he'd won the lottery. Great! I'll pick you up at 7. Rick didn't say anything as Ted drove off, but his jaw was clenched so tight it hurt. Zarathia turned to him once the truck was out of sight, her expression unreadable. You disapprove. Damn right I disapprove, he snapped. Ted's a jerk, and you don't know the first thing about Earth dances. You'll stick out like a sore thumb. I can adapt, she said simply. And your reaction suggests that perhaps you should be the one escorting me. Rick hesitated, caught off guard. What? You clearly do not wish for me to go with Ted. Why not accompany me yourself? He opened his mouth to argue, but no words came out. The idea of showing up at the dance with Zarathia, of letting everyone in town see them together, was both terrifying and strangely appealing. He wasn't sure what scared him more, the judgmental stares, or the way she'd called him her mate with such certainty. Before he could decide, Zarathia turned and walked back toward the barn. You have until this evening to make your decision, she said over her shoulder. But I will not wait forever. Rick spent the rest of the day trying to work, but his thoughts kept drifting back to her. He didn't want her going with Ted, but he also didn't know if he was ready to face what it would mean to take her himself. By the time the sun set, he still hadn't made up his mind. When Zarathia stepped out of the barn, though, all his doubts vanished. She wasn't glowing faintly anymore. She was radiant, her entire form shimmering like a living star. She'd managed to fashion a dress out of some old fabric, and while it wasn't exactly traditional, it suited her in a way Rick couldn't explain. You clean up well, he said, trying to sound casual. She tilted her head, her glow softening. Does this meet your cultural standards? Rick smiled faintly. You look perfect. She stepped closer, her expression uncharacteristically shy. Then will you accompany me? Rick hesitated for only a moment before nodding. Yeah. Let's go. The dance was exactly as awkward as Rick had expected, but having Zarathia by his side made it bearable. Ted tried to cut in several times, but Zarathia shut him down with polite but firm refusals that left him sputtering. The rest of the town was too busy staring at her to cause any trouble, and by the end of the night, Rick realized he didn't care what they thought. As they walked back to the farm under the stars, Zarathia glanced at him with a small, satisfied smile. I believe this ritual was successful. Rick chuckled. Yeah, I guess it was. She stopped, turning to face him fully. Rick, I have been considering something. What's that? She stepped closer, her glow intensifying. If my people retrieve me, I may never return to this world. But if I stay, I will be hunted. Rick's chest tightened. So what are you saying? I am saying that I would rather face the dangers of this world than leave it behind. If you will have me. Rick stared at her, his heart pounding. For once, he didn't try to come up with an excuse or a deflection. He simply smiled and said, Yeah. I'll have you. Her smile brightened, and for the first time, Rick realized her glow wasn't just alien biology, it was happiness.